10th, 2017. My name is Kuldip Randhawa. I live in Surrey, BC, British Columbia, a province of Canada, a nation that's considered at the forefront of human rights. This video concerns itself with the discipline proceedings against Mr. Ahmed Raza, which in my view were done in bad faith against Mr. Raza. So as part of professional courtesy, I'm reaching out to Mr. Raza to contact me, so perhaps we can deal with this thing before a penalty is issued. But regardless, my message to APEGBC upon this video being issued is that no penalty should be issued against Mr. Raza. The proceedings are actually in bad faith. I know there were two proceedings that were held on that day, on the same day for convenience perhaps. So this video only concerns itself with the one which is referenced as T16-080. So that's the one in which Mr. Raza had accepted some glass rails. In considering this, one has to consider that APEGBC has actually endorsed a guideline. It's a practice guideline for professional engineers in designing guardrails. That document has been prepared by 5 professional engineers who are working with other companies. So having been endorsed by APEGBC, this document is actually misleading professional engineers in BC. It has statements that make no logical sense, and so therefore it should not be relied upon from an engineering point of view. Because it has the intent of misleading professional engineers, and if that is what's happening, then they should not be actually disciplined when APEG itself is not following engineering standards. It's a requirement of the profession that when a regulatory body is not understanding basic engineering procedures, design parameters, that it cannot regulate the profession of engineers. So let's consider some statements that were made in the guidelines. First one is 1.2.2, where it talks about jurisdiction. It talks about local requirements being met. Well, the design of guardrails has to be done to a standard. Local requirements cannot exceed the standards. Further, under section 1.2.3, it is stated that the guide is not a standard, but just a document that talks about essential parameters that have to be considered or met. Well, if you consider some of those statements, you'll find that there's a contradiction itself. A standard has to be used in a certain area, so a standard that's applicable in British Columbia applies to every professional engineer in British Columbia when designing guardrails, according to this guideline. So local requirements do not have to be met, because local requirements are never established by the municipality. Certainly if they are, they're not going to exceed that of the standards. And so who is establishing the local requirements? That's just another way of saying that one has to follow a building inspector who doesn't understand engineering because he takes a certain interpretation of the guideline and then ignores the standards. And so one has to be careful. Then you've got section 2, where you've done a review of codes and standards. One must appreciate that a certain number of loads have been stated in there that have been extracted from the design standards, which is fine. One has to, provide a summary in the guideline. But every standard does not apply to every guardrail. One has to be very careful because there are certain designs out there which do not fall within certain design standards. So the requirement of an engineer to use discretion is always there. One is entitled to have discretion in engineering. Engineers have that right. When that right is taken away because lawyers do not understand the process, then that's where problems occur. So let us consider some of the parameters stated in the design of guardrails according to this guideline. One parameter is clearly stated that the deflection can be up to 40 millimeters. When you consider the height of a handrail of 1.1 meters, 40 millimeters of deflection is considerable. The entire purpose of the standards is to establish certain objective statements and functional statements. A guardrail has to function to provide security and safety to the people who are using this guardrail as they're exiting a certain passageway or coming down the stairs. If a guardrail is allowed and approved with 40 millimeters of deflection, it does not achieve the objectives. So this guideline is totally inaccurate when it comes to stating that 40 millimeters is an acceptable criteria for glass handrails. That is quite excessive. It does not achieve the function of a guardrail. So another requirement is that the design of this glass handrail has to be done with the alternative panels failing. The design has to be done with a top cap plate which is in place. A cap plate that crosses over 3 panels, for example. Well, if the alternative panel has failed, well then the cap plate will not provide the strength that is required to the panel under design. And so it makes no logical sense what's been stated here. The design of these handrails have to be purely independent panel per panel. One cannot rely on adjacent panels considering cap plates where the alternative panels have failed, because then the cap plates are ineffective. One has to be very careful. There's also another terminology used here, such as progressive collapse. That word is inappropriate here. Progressive collapse is actually used when describing the failure mechanism of, say, an apartment building, where one floor has actually failed and collapsed and it falls down a certain height to the floor below. So now you have dynamic loads coming down, live loads, in addition to the live load of the floor, plus the dead load of the floor below. And so now that second floor has also collapsed. Now you have 2 floors going down to the third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. And now you've got a situation when you consider the bird's eye view of an apartment building where one section of the apartment building has totally collapsed right down to the ground. That is progressive collapse. Using that terminology for guardrails is actually very dangerous because it's inappropriate. Progressive collapse cannot occur at all, nor should it be used in a secondary structure. The guide does recognize the primary structure and secondary structures. A primary structure would be a building, a secondary structure would be a guardrail. If the guardrail fails, the primary structure will not fail. But if the primary structure fails, then most definitely the secondary structure would fail. So now you've got a situation of a guardrail that's been attached to a certain structure where you've got earthquake, for example, and now certain motions are taking place. Now you've got the panels which are attached to, say, a cross bridge. And now those panels are going to break and crack because you've got motions in place. There's no mention of that in the guideline. So taking a guideline which is incomplete is not something that one should use because it's, 1, inaccurate, and 2, it's incomplete. So one has to be careful that when issuing a guideline, it does not mislead the public and certainly not the professional engineers. And so these comments have to be considered as part of professional courtesy. I will be approaching those 5 engineers who have written this guideline probably in 2018. And perhaps we can sit down over coffee and discuss this and how changes can be made before further engineers start using this guideline and making further errors, and they are then disciplined by APEGBC, because it seems to me that their engineers are first being misled by APEGBC and then they're being disciplined. And the ones who are creating the standards which are not to the engineering standard are being held not accountable, or are being told that's okay. You've now got statements in there saying that the guideline is not a standard. So if it's not a standard, who's going to take the jurisdiction? Who's going to take the blame when some engineer has used this guideline that's been endorsed by APEGBC? I think APEGBC then is also liable under these circumstances. So let's consider two statements that are made here. That the deflection is excessive, that should not be permitted, that should be changed immediately. And secondly, that you cannot design this glass panel with the top rail in place. The top rail does provide additional strength, but it cannot be considered for the design. It should be excluded. So let's take an example. You've got the city of Surrey, for example, where you've got a foyer, and there's basically two buildings either side of the foyer. There's the east wing and the west wing, and it's 6 stories high. And so there's about 5 cross bridges that connect the east wing to the west wing, which has a glass handrail. And often there are functions held, and the foyer is often also connected to the council chambers, where the sliding doors open up, and now you've got the foyer being an extended area where people are sitting. And sometimes you have functions there, some cultural events, maybe some dancing. So when that happens, you've got people standing on the bridge at the 6th floor or the 5th, and they're all placing a certain load against the glass rail because they all want to watch the dancing that's taking place downstairs. And the foyer is also a means of exiting, so in case of a problem, people can exit. So you've got a situation now where in an earthquake, the motion is going to take into place and the glass is going to break because it's quite brittle. Sure, it could be thick enough, but is it designed for that situation? And if it does fail in this particular instance, it's going to be falling down, where glass are going to be spearheading down onto the foyer, an area which is used for egressing the building and exiting. So clearly that is not safe, because all the purpose of this discipline process is for public safety. So how many of these handrails have been designed where the guideline has not been followed, or it has been followed where the guideline itself is incorrect? How many of these engineers are going to be investigated by APEGBC? Or is it just stated somewhere that the Randhawa has to be investigated and Mr. Ahmed has to be investigated? Does it only apply to some engineers? Let's do a proper investigation if you're really concerned about investigating the profession. Because I think there's a double standard being applied here. That double standard is always based upon a certain procedure being established, which conveys to the public that a certain procedure has been followed according to the Engineers Act, when clearly that is not the case. In this particular case, for the discipline against Mr. Ahmed, the witness was the compliance officer. Ahmed did not provide all of the calculations, and I'm quite certain that the compliance officer did not provide any calculations. Because if it's an ICBC matter, for example, the RCMP will be attending the accident scene, and they would be expert witnesses. Their reports will be submitted. They would have to be considered. So now you've got a situation where a compliance officer is really talking about the procedure, and when Mr. Ahmed had stated that he did not provide all of the documents because he has a busy office, and I know he is busy, you have to consider that you have to be working like we are working here to really appreciate what we're going through, especially when APEGBC is issuing guidelines which are incorrect, and there are engineers who now fear coming forward, so therefore self-regulation does not take place. This is a body that has to be investigated by the RCMP, because in my case they certainly were involved in criminal acts. This particular case against Mr. Ahmed, it would be close to criminal negligence. There's a difference there, because you are being negligent if you're going to continue using this guideline, or getting engineers to write guidelines who are then not going to be disciplined. So I think I've stated enough that when you've got a handrail that's attached to the glass panels, and the handrail is then continuous, the correct terminology that I would use for this guideline is not progressive collapse, it is instant collapse, because you now got a situation where the load is all applied instantly at the same time, because you've got 10 people standing there leaning against the glass handrail, overlooking the foyer where there's a function. There's certain equipment that is used to clean the cross bridge. That equipment is sometimes mechanical and it moves against the glass rails. Is there a sort of a kick plate in place in these situations so that the impact of the machinery that's cleaning the floor does not impact the glass? So clearly there are issues that need to be addressed. One does not have to be 4 engineers to provide letters of assurance, as is indicated. You talk about the design, and then you talk about designers, and then you talk about the professional engineer taking the responsibility. They are not the same things. When you've got a company out there that's creating a design of a guardrail, he's really talking about the looks. He's not talking about the integrity of the structure. What needs to be done is this, that most manufacturers need to have a engineer on board, just like trust companies have their own engineers. So they should be required. And then the professional engineer who's taking the responsibility only needs to do a cursory review. The professional engineer who's going to provide his schedules to the city is not involved with the contractor sometimes, and sometimes the contractors do not follow the advice given by the engineer. So that is also another way in which the safety is affected. But you always seem to be focusing on investigating engineers simply because you feel that is your way of making money, because it's not regulation. I've just proven to you in this video that there are serious flaws in the guideline. And so what right do you have to investigate professional engineers when you're misleading them through guidelines prepared by other engineers who are never going to be probably held accountable or disciplined? So I think I've said enough. There's serious problems here when it comes to engineering, and APEGBC need to be held accountable under law. Any engineer who wishes to contact me, in particular Mr. Ahmed Raza, you can contact me. I think you know where I am. I'm about 2 doors away from you. My email for other engineers who do not know me, whether you are in Prince Rupert or whether you are Prince George, you can contact me by email, kuldiprandhawa5@gmail.com. That's KULDIPRANDHAWA5@gmail.com. God bless.